Hi everyone, welcome to this talk which is hopefully going to help you with your Imperial Image revision or work. Today it's going to be on Moral Decadence, which is a poem by Horace, also known as Ode 3.7 and published in 23 BC. So be trying to have a think already about what that date means in terms of Augustus's career, but we will of course talk about different points as we go through. All right, so just some general poetry points to remember. The first thing to remember about poetry is that it's written for entertainment. It's not written to educate. It's not written to push a political agenda. So it's there to entertain people. And think about it a little bit as if you might think about listening to a song or watching a band. You know, think about how much you're listening to those words and thinking about the implications of them. Another thing to think about with poetry, I don't have the answers, by the way, I'm just asking you to think about them, is what is the breadth of the Roman audience? Now that's a little bit uncertain, isn't it? Because we know, or we think we know really, that very little of Rome's population was literate. So very little would have had access to reading the poems that we study. But it may have been that quite a lot of them heard them. But it also may have been the point that not a lot of them heard them, because maybe they were just performed at the dinner parties of the nobility, the elites, the rich. But the thing is, we don't really know. So try not to make sweeping statements about how successful poetry was. And also, when you're thinking about how successful the poetry is, think about the audience it's targeted at. Augustus had a lot of work to do with the senators. Some loved him, but some would have been very unsure and uncertain about the agenda that he was pushing forward. So think about that. So maybe it was important for him to have poets of high culture pushing a certain image of him. There's lots to think about. Also, I think when we're talking about success, it is worth considering the fact that we're still an audience today, that Horace is still accessed today, that Horace is still studied in terms of his portrayal of the imperial image. Another thing I do want you to think about, which I just thought about the other day, is that obviously, in the Imperial Image, we only study the poems that seem to mention Rome or Augustus or refer to the image he was creating. But actually, you know, these types of poems were just one of many different types of poems that were circulating in the Roman world. So we shouldn't sort of be very narrow-minded in thinking that all the poetry the audience were hearing was about Rome or Augustus. It's like there was lots of different poetry about lots of different subjects. So it may well have been diluted. The messages may well have been diluted among that. So just a few things there for you to think about. So I'm going to just introduce you to some scholarship here, which is relevant generally on a lot of fronts, but also quite useful, and we'll see how in this poem. So Goldsworthy suggests that if the poets didn't favour the restoration of religious rights, the return of stability and the defeat of dangerous foreign enemies, this would have been unusual. They were not writing propaganda, just echoing the sentiments of the time. And if you wanted to learn any scholarly quotes, I would just focus on that bit at the end there. They were not writing propaganda, just echoing the sentiments of the time. And that's Goldsworthy's opinion. And I'm actually quite convinced by that opinion, that actually the poets, they're writing to entertain, so they need their poetry to be popular, so they need to tap into how people are feeling about this period. And that is going to be quite relevant with this poem, which is a little bit more negative perhaps than the other poetry that we read. And then we have Wallace Hadrill, who suggests that by the latter part, so the later part of Augustus's reign, what matters is the chain of values in which Augustus is the vital link: divine blessing, Roman tradition, purity and justice, peace and high culture. And Roman tradition, I think, is something that we're going to see in this poem. And even though this is sort of the middle part of his reign, we do see this poem moving into Augustus's concerns about Roman tradition and moral values. And then this is quite an interesting one, I think. So Beard suggests that the start of Augustus's relationship with Livia had a scandalous tinge. Again, the lovely Beard phraseology there. So yeah, it's also just worth remembering that when Augustus started his relationship with Livia, they were both married, and there were, you know, babies on the way. And I think that's really important, is that would have been frowned upon, perhaps, according to Beard, and perhaps not forgotten that quickly, particularly from someone who much later in his career is trying to portray himself as a moral role model. So lots of interesting scholarship there that could apply to lots of different essays and lots of different discussions, not just discussions of this poem. Okay, so let's have a look at the poem. Romans, though you're guiltless, you still expiate your father's sins, till you've restored the temples and the tumbling shrines of all the gods and their images, soiled with black smoke. So straight away, we've got negative imagery here, though, haven't we? We've got tumbling shrines, we've got black smoke, we've got language like soiled and sins. So Horace is very much setting his stall out here that this is not. He's not feeling positive. He's not dancing with unfettered feet anymore. He sounds a bit cross, actually. What he's referring to when he talks about expiating his father's sins, or expiating your father's sins, we're not really sure. Scholars haven't really agreed on. Some think that he's talking about Romulus killing Remus. Some think he's talking about, the previous generation that caused the civil wars, people like Marius and Sulla. But basically, it's unclear. Again, what's a little bit confusing is the opening line where he addresses the Romans. It very much tells us the audience he is addressing here, though you're guiltless, which doesn't really fit with much of the rest of the poem. He doesn't really seem to think that present Romans are guiltless, but we'll see. The focus here is very much on neglect, so the neglect of religious rites and the fact that they need to be restored. And there is also very much a sense that they've not been restored yet. Okay, let's move on. You rule because you are lower than the gods you worship. All things begin with them. Credit them with the outcome. Neglected gods have had many woes for sad Italy. Again, that first part, he seems quite cross. It's like he's trying to remind the Romans who are reading this that they are below the gods. So maybe this sense of arrogance that the Romans have gathered in previous years is what Horace is referring to there. The gods need to be worshipped. They have been neglected. And many woes for sad Italy. It's very much, woes, sad, neglected. There's quite a sad tone to this, a feeling of regret, not a feeling of growing positivity, really. And so, 23 BC, what does that reflect about the feeling of the time? Not necessarily that everyone's like, go Augustus, we love you, you've made everything better. So really interesting poem on that front. Already Parthians and Menaces and Pacorus have crushed our inauspicious assaults. Inauspicious means not favoured by the gods, and laugh now to have added our spoils to their meagre treasures. So here we're talking about the Parthian standards, our spoils. And this is obviously something that's really heavy in the Roman mindset, is the stealing of the taking of the Parthian standards in 53 BC. They will be returned in 3 years, but they're obviously something of great concern. Remember, Antony had tried to get them back and failed miserably. So we're talking about the enemies of Rome here, and then it moves on to talk about more of them. Dacians and Ethiopians have almost toppled the city, mired in civil war. The last feared for their fleet of ships, and the others who are best known for their flying arrows. So here he's talking in poetic terms about the enemies of Rome, the Dacians, the Ethiopians who tried to topple the city. And by focusing on that in these 2 verses, it's a reminder to Rome about the consequences of neglecting the gods. This is what Horace is saying, is you neglect the gods, and that means you're going to be vulnerable to attack, because the gods won't be protecting you anymore. So again, lots of negative language: crushed, inauspicious, assaults, meagre, toppled, civil war. He directly references the civil wars here. Feared. So yeah, lots to talk about there in terms of his language, the impression he's giving, the feeling that he is presenting to the Romans. And this continues. Our age, fertile in its wickedness, that almost seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? Fertile and wickedness, has first defiled the marriage bed, our offspring and homes. Disaster's stream has flowed from this source through the people and the fatherland. So again, he's blaming the Romans of his day for all of the disasters, for all of the bad things that are happening, that have happened to Rome. The young girl early takes delight in learning Greek dances, in being dressed with all the arts, and soon meditates on sinful affairs and with every fibre of her new being. Now, what there seems to be here is a link between the Greek world and immorality. And that was quite common, because even though the Greek world was upheld for sort of a golden age of art and culture, it was also held as being responsible for many of Rome's problems. The wealth that came in from the Greek world in the middle of the 2nd century BC and after that was seen as leading to people being more materialistic, more selfish, more focused on money rather than the traditional Roman values that we know so well. So yeah, we're moving on here to a different element of immorality. This is not just about not worshipping the gods. Later at her husband's dinner, she searches for younger lovers, doesn't mind to whom she grants all her swift illicit pleasures when the lights are far removed, but she rises openly when ordered to do so, and not without her husband's knowledge, whether it's for some peddler or Spanish ship's captain, an extravagant buyer of her shame. So interestingly, the focus is very much here on women and their inability to behave in the way we would expect, well, the Romans would expect Roman women to behave. Even though she's married, it seems like her husband has knowledge of this. She is described in almost sort of manipulative terms. She doesn't care who she's going to be sharing her swift illicit pleasures with. It could be a peddler or a ship's captain, or she could even be a prostitute, someone who could be paying for it, an extravagant buyer. And this is where I brought in the Beard quote, so about suggesting that his relationship with Livia had a scandalous tinge, and perhaps they are linked in the fact that Horace is being quite critical here of the Romans of his own day and their morality, and perhaps his audience would have thought of the fact that actually Augustus hasn't been that moral. And perhaps this kind of tone in this poem is what was the driving force behind Augustus's moral laws of 18 BC. But there's certainly, again, a very negative picture here of women, a very negative picture of morality. So we've got immorality, we've got neglect of the gods. What's next, I hear you ask? Now, the tone here turns to the past. The young men who stained the Punic Sea with blood, they were not born of such parentage. Those who struck at Pyrrhus and struck at great Antiochus and fearful Hannibal. They were a virile crowd of rustic soldiers, taught to turn the furrow with a Sabine hoe, to bring in the firewood they had cut at the instruction of their strict mothers. Now, this is a really traditional view of Romans. So the young men he's talking about are the young men who fought the Carthaginians. So we're talking about end of the 3rd, 2nd century BC, when Romans were real Romans. I'm talking from Horace's point of view here, of course. He's saying that these men who fought in wars against great leaders such as Pyrrhus, Antiochus and Hannibal, these were proper Roman soldiers. They were virile, they were rustic. When he talks about turning the furrow with the Sabine hoe, he's talking about they're farmers at heart, they're strong, they're bringing in firewood, and they were parented well. They have strict mothers. This is what women should be doing, bringing up their boys well, not worrying about peddlers or Spanish sea captains. And this shows very much the stoicism and the traditional nature of what the Romans really aspired to and what Augustus wanted to bring them back to. And that ties into what Wallace Hadrill says about the later part of Augustus's reign, when he's trying to put in place this chain of values, which Horace is showing there is very much a need to do in this poem. Remember, again, thinking back to what Goldsworthy said, these poets are tapping into the feelings of their audience. He wouldn't be saying these things if there wasn't a problem. And then to finish the poem off, so he's still talking about these model Romans, when the sun had lengthened the mountain shadows, I mean the beautiful language here, and lifted the yokes from the weary bullocks, bringing a welcome time of rest with the departure of his chariot. So he's almost bringing this is the end of the time of these true Romans. What do the harmful days not render less? Worse than our grandparents' generation, our parents then produced us, even worse, and soon to bear still more sinful children. So we've got the repetition of worse, the emphasis here on grandparents, on generations, on parents, and looking to the future. Usually Horace is so positive about looking to the future, but here he ends on talking about sinful children, and he's talking about his audience and the children that they would have had. So again, think about what Goldsworthy says about echoing the sentiments of the time. When you're talking about the success of Augustus's propaganda, perhaps this shows that the Romans are still not happy, is that there are still real problems in Roman society. So again, a really interesting poem from Horace, quite different. We don't have any mention of Augustus. We don't have any mention of Augustus's deeds here. But what we do have is a real indicator of the feeling in Rome at the time, which can be very useful when we're talking about success and audience and the historical context. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you very much.